you're not unlikable, you're just bland. And I don't want to read about a bland main character. Let's talk about my August reads. Hi, if you're new here, my name is Ivana. I really like to read and talk about books. Today I'm going to share the 5 books I read in August. August is an unusually slow reading month for me. Normally I read around twice as many books as I did this August. Normally I read around 10 books. But in August I had the privilege to visit Mexico City with 2 of my friends who are also booktubers, Kat and Kat. And I did do a blog about that. If you would like to check it out, I'll link it downstairs and it'll be here too. So this reading month was far from perfect, but I did have a few favorites. So I thought it would be fun to share them from the ones that I like the most to the ones that I like the least. So we're gonna start with the best book that I read in August, and that was without a doubt Heavy by Kiese Laymon. Kiese Laymon is a black man who is a professor who grew up in Mississippi. I believe he was born in the 70s. I need to stop saying that I'm normally not a crier in books because this book made me cry so hard, and so did the other one I'm going to talk about. This book was so powerful. It was so raw and real and unflinching. Kiese Laymon also narrates his own book, so I was able to tandem listen to the audiobook and physically read this book. I underlined the crap out of it. This book tackles racism, black masculinity, violence, sexual assault, Kiese's issues with weight, gambling addiction. It's written in second person from Kiese to his mom. And I just love any book that explores like mother-daughter relationships, but this is really nice that it was a mother-son relationship. Kiese does a really good job of honoring his elders. He writes very frankly about his mother and his grandmother, and especially his mother, who was far from perfect. In the eyes of anybody else, they'd be like, oh my god, my mom is an abuser, blah, blah, blah. Kiese is very nuanced about his depictions of his mom. He shows the good, the bad, and the ugly when it comes to his mother and when it even comes to himself. And I think that that makes this memoir so strong. The fact that he can show so much more respect for his mom while also holding the fact that she was far from perfect as a mother and that she might not have always been the best parent. I think he also does the same for his friends and his girlfriends. He's able to capture the essence of certain people in his life through many different stories. So there is a narrative in here. I love the way that this book is organized. Every essay focuses on one word. So every essay, the title is one word. You get to see how different stories in his life and different experiences that he's had connect to that word. One of my favorite things about this memoir is Kiese's love for reading and rereading and the transformative power of books and revision. That's something that his mom always instilled in him from a young age. Like, I wish I could even pick out a section of this book to read to you because it's just so strong, but I think everybody should read this book. It was published in 2018, and I also feel like I might be the last person to read this book, but I can't stress enough how good it is, and I'm so excited to revisit it later. I love the idea of revisiting books, especially books that you've annotated, because it's like having a conversation with your past self, and I don't think that that's something that I've done enough. So I know that Read Kayla Read on Bookstagram has a 5 rereads challenge that was inspired by Kiese Laymon's words. And I don't know if I'm going to reread 5 books, but I definitely want to reread a couple this year just to start that practice. And I like the idea of like, you know, books bring you comfort. Books can also be very insightful. And I just want to be able to re-experience books. This is a must read. Thank you to Kat from Kat's Field Notes for gifting this to me in December of 2021. I'm sorry it took me so long. I think it found me at the right time though. My second favorite book of August was INVENCIBLE, Verano de Liliana, or Liliana's Invincible Summer in English. I talked about this book in my previous vlog, and I talked about how I read it in Mexico City. This book is written by Cristina Rivera Garza, whose sister, Liliana, this is a picture of her, was murdered in the summer of 1990. This book investigates her murder nearly 20 years later. Cristina takes it upon herself to go through Liliana's journals. She also interviews Liliana's friends and her own family. And she also looks at letters that Liliana wrote to her friends and that her friends wrote her. Oh, and her boyfriends too. This is a true crime book that is done so well. It's very respectful. It keeps you engaged throughout. I would say maybe the first 20 pages are a little bit slow because Cristina sets the stage for us as readers to understand what happened. This is not a spoiler. Liliana was presumably murdered by her boyfriend. For some reason, I'm not going to say what happened. He never got arrested and nothing happened. It was such an experience reading this in Mexico City because every time Cristina talked about a place, I was like, oh my God, I've been there. Or, oh my God, that's like a 15-minute drive from here. I literally had to pause to cry so many times because it was just so moving. Liliana was such a good writer. She really was so vivacious, so full of life, so funny, so insightful, so deep. And I'm gonna read you a little quote from her journal entries. This is at the beginning of the book. I'm gonna read it in Spanish, but I'm gonna show you the subtitles. And this is just something she wrote in her journal. She really had a lot of aspirations. She wanted to become an architect. It's titled, Este cielo enojosamente azul. Busco. Quiero probar cosas nuevas. Quizá más dolor y más soledad, pero creo que vale la pena. Sé que hay algo más que estas cuatro paredes y este cielo enojosamente azul. Like, what happens to her is a microcosm of what happens to women everywhere, women who are victims of gendered violence. Mexico City and other countries like the United States, like, we've made a lot of strides to name violence and name harassment and name abuse, but violence against women and femicide just continues happening. Rivera Garza in the book tells us that every day 10 women in Mexico are killed by their partners, which is wild. I'm sure that the numbers are comparable in the United States and around the world. And this is simply unacceptable. So there is like a call to action in this book. Some people might not like this book because it might feel a little disjointed. She really has you read between the lines, but I personally really like that. I thought it was like thrilling. I felt like I was reading a suspense novel. It was really scary. I also really recommend this one. I can't vouch for the English translation, but if you're looking for a true crime book that isn't exploitative, I would say this is a really, really good one. So those were two favorites for me. Now we're gonna go to like the books that I thought were solid. The first book I thought was solid was the only YA book I read in August, which was Warrior Girl Unearthed. I checked this out from the library, but I actually listened to it on Scribd. And this is the second book in the Firekeeper's Daughter universe. I say universe, but it's not fantasy. This follows an Anishinaabe 17, 18-year-old girl named Perry Firekeeper Birch. She is the niece of the main character of Angeline Boulley's previous book, The Firekeeper's Daughter. And she is reckless, and all she wants to do the summer before senior year is go fishing. She's a really talented fisherwoman, but she crashes her aunt's car and she has to work at the community center as a result. They place her and other Anishinaabe kids in different roles in her community, and for one of her placements, she ends up at a local university where the remains of this warrior girl are. The warrior girl happens to be Anishinaabe herself. She's one of Perry's ancestors. So Perry and her friends really want to return warrior girl along with the remains of other Anishinaabe folks back to their tribe. This book was really angsty, which I love. It also taught me about the, I'm gonna read this, so that's why I'm looking that way, Native American Graves Protection and Reparation Act of 1990, which essentially says that if anybody in the United States finds indigenous remains or sacred objects or any kind of artifact, that they do belong to the ancestors of those people and to the tribes, so you can't keep it or sell it. However, it seems like everything before 1990 is fair game. She sees that people who are not native or indigenous are selling things on eBay that don't belong to them, claiming they found them before 1990. And so it's really interesting to see Perry and her friends fight back against the folks who are exploiting it, including academics and anthropologists and museums. So non-native people who seem to be well-meaning but are clearly not. I think Perry was a really good role model. I think she's a badass. I will absolutely be reading Angeline Boulley's next book, but I felt that The Firekeeper's Daughter was better. Even though there is some controversy around that one, I found it a little bit more complex and intriguing. So another book that I read that was pretty solid was The Adult by Bronwyn Fischer. And this book follows a white Canadian 18, 19-year-old who's starting college in a college town. She moves away from home and she goes to the park and she meets this older woman and they develop a relationship. or a situationship. And Natalie is like very much into making this a secret. She really hides her tracks. She starts saying that she has a boyfriend. So there were some things that bothered me about this book, but I do have to say, like, campus novels are having a moment in my life. I feel like if you have any recommendations for campus novels, I would love to hear them. I think queer representation is really important. It was nice to see an age gap relationship being explored where it wasn't just an older man and a younger woman, because I feel like that's like a little bit overdone sometimes. This book actually reminded me of the Taylor Swift song Could've, Would've, Should've. What I didn't like about this book was the main character. Now, I'm all for an unlikable main character. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I would never be friends with this person, but I still appreciate this unlikable character. But with Natalie, it was literally like, you're not unlikable, you're just bland. And I don't want to read about a bland main character. But that's just me. I would read more books by Bronwyn Fischer, so I'm excited for what else she writes. But I just felt like this book was just pretty solid. Now we're gonna get into the book that I didn't like, and we're also gonna talk about my DNFs because I keep forgetting to mention my DNFs, and I do DNF a lot, and I am team DNF 100% of the way. So I mentioned I went to Mexico City, and on the way there, we had to take 2 flights. I am deathly afraid of flying, so I decided to read a silly romance novel on the way to Mexico City, and I decided to read Hello Stranger by Katherine. Again, romance isn't normally my genre. I have read some romance, but I feel like once I discovered Korean dramas, I was like, I'm not reading romance novels anymore because Korean dramas scratch that itch so much better. And this book sounded so promising. It's about a woman who's a portrait artist who is really talented. She is a finalist in a national portrait competition. She has like a couple of months to create a portrait to submit to the competition. And one day she's crossing the street and she has a seizure and chaos ensues and she ends up with face blindness, which I didn't even know what that was, but it means that you can't recognize people by their faces. Like, you can see the individual components of somebody's face, but you can't really recognize them all together. You can't even recognize yourself. And so for her, obviously it's a big problem because she's a portrait artist. Her mother died when she was younger, and she has a contentious relationship with her father and her stepfamily. Her best friend is away, so she needs a model for her contest, and she ends up somehow with her womanizing neighbor, and she has to do this thing where she like touches his face in order to like figure out like how his face works. And honestly, this book was just, again, the premise sounds really interesting, but the book just felt totally flat for me. She has a one-dimensional evil stepsister. The last quarter of the book is just a hot mess that is like very implausible. Like, I understand that things don't always have to be plausible in a book, especially a romance novel, but it just felt really like amateurish. And I actually really liked Katherine Center's other books. I remember I read The Bodyguard last year, which is about a woman who's a bodyguard to a famous actor, and that was really fun, but this one just like missed the mark for me completely. I think it was terrible. And I normally don't say that about books, but it was terrible. So now let's move on to DNFs. DNF stands for did not finish. These are 2 books that I did not finish. The first one, unfortunately, is Conversations with Friends by Sally Rooney. I just wasn't invested in the characters. I thought the premise was really strong. You have these 2 spoken word artists who used to date and now they're broken up, and they both meet another couple and like they kind of fall for different people in that couple. And I love Sally Rooney's musings in her books. I loved Beautiful World, Where Are You? And Normal People is like a favorite of mine now. But maybe I'm thinking like I was trying to read it in an airplane and I was like sleep deprived, so maybe that's why I didn't like it, but I did get to page 50. I think what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna try to pick it up some other time. And then I also DNF'd Paul by Daisy Lafarge. This book is sticky and hot, and it's about a girl who answers an ad to work at a French countryside farm. And the owner of the farm is this dude named Paul, and he is just so obnoxious that I was like, I don't want to read a book that centers on a man, especially a man who's traveled the world and feels so cultured and like is very condescending. I'm like, I feel like I get enough condescending men in the real world. I understand that many women like fall prey and get gaslit by men like that, but I don't want to read a book about that, even a tiny, like it was short. and I read a lot of it too. I don't want to read about that. So that's another book that I DNF'd. So yeah, those were the books that I read in August. If you have any recommendations for me, like any campus novels to read over the fall or the winter, please let me know. I also want to hear about how your reading is going, so let me know if you have any new favorites. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I hope that you have a lovely day. Peace.